And we are live. Hello and welcome to BookTrib's Facebook Live author interview series brought to you by BookTrib and our partner Penguin Publishing Group. My name is Chelsea Ciccone. I'm an editor at BookTrib, which is the leading source for book news and reviews. And today I'm really excited to be joined by author Alma Katsu to discuss her book, The Deep. So welcome, Alma.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here today.
And we're so excited to have you. This is such a fascinating book. And so why don't we start out, you'll just tell us a little bit about The Deep.
Okay. Well, like my previous book, The Hunger, this is a reimagining. In this case, it's a reimagining of the sinking of the Titanic, but also its sister ship, the Britannic. So the main story has to do with a young Irish woman who gets hired on as a stewardess, basically a maid, on the Titanic. And she connects with one of the passengers, and it starts this strange chain of supernatural goings on the ship. But before we can figure out what's going on, the big event that we all know about, the sinking, the tragic sinking, happens. But that's not the end of the story. 4 years later, she reconnects with the same passenger and on the sister ship, the Britannic, and the strange happenings start again. And it forces her to confront what her role might be in both tragedies.
That's wow. Two sinkings.
Right, one's not enough.
Yeah. So, let's talk about a little bit about you at first. Before you published your first novel, you worked in government intelligence, which is wow. What a change. Now we're fiction. But how did that experience influence both your writing and how you research?
It's a really interesting thing because, and actually I did it until just a few years ago. I retired. So the first 8 or so years of my writing life overlap with the last years of working in intelligence. And I always thought going into it that they were very separate. And it wasn't until over time that I really saw how the two were woven together. So one is, and this happened after my first book was published, one of the vice presidents at Simon & Schuster, I was at a meeting and she turned to me and she said, "Your characters, they're all so devious and manipulative. And does that have anything to do with your job?" And I was kind of shocked and I thought, no, this is a book about magic. And then I thought about it and I'm like, yes, that's exactly it. Because that's kind of the business of CIA. It's the business of human intelligence is what is the field. And what that really is trying to get people to divulge secrets. And you do that by, unfortunately, manipulating them. I mean, sometimes they're very witting to the fact that they're being manipulated. But so I've spent most of my adult life around people who are very good at manipulating other people and do it all the time, unfortunately. I mean, even when they shouldn't be, they're doing it. So like on the job, not great. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, which is a little bit more obvious, is just the researching skills. As an analyst, I've spent almost 35 years as an analyst, and that's a lot of research. And you just get very comfortable with handling very complex research topics. And that's just been perfect for writing these historical-based novels.
I bet, yeah. I can see how that, at least on the research end, but that's really interesting to hear about the fictional end,
Yeah, people really like my villains. And I have to say, that's probably where I get it from. I'm saying this a little tongue in cheek. Of course, most people who work at the agency, are great people and they manage to, use their skills for good and not evil. But there's just some people that it really messes with your personality. And it can make working in such a highly charged environment, kind of difficult from time. And I guess over time, it just sort of seeped into my mindset, almost like the way water will seep into things. That I can just recreate that kind of personality on the page, I think. Yeah. So my villains are great.
Yeah, and you do it so well.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you.
So what does your research process look like? Like, what do you do to prepare for a story like The Deep?
So this might make some people a little unhappy because I'm very efficient. I've come over time to really value efficiency in the research process. And so I do think, because I have a lot of people asking me about that. They come up to me at events and ask for advice or ask me this question. And, I'm pretty disciplined about it. But I can do that because this is what I've done my whole life. I realized in talking to folks that, there's a lot of people who want to write or are working on a historical novel, and they haven't done anything like this since high school or college. And so it's kind of daunting for them. But when you do it day in and day out, you kind of establish these, routines to make it easier. So I'm actually pretty ruthless about it. Believe it or not, usually the first phase of research for me, I don't even spend 2 weeks on it. I'll narrow my search down to 2 primary books that I'll use that, I think about what the book is about and what are the things where I have the biggest gaps in knowledge. And then I'll find 2 primary research books that cover those topics. And I'll really go into a lot of depth with them, take a lot of notes, do a lot of outlining, timelines, all of that stuff. But after that, then I start the outlining process. And as I'm writing the book, I'll just do a lot of spot research for the little things. So I try not to rely on the historical event itself to tell me what the story should be. I know some writers like to do that. They sort of look for interesting little tidbits or, not very commonly known side events that may have happened. And that's always fun when you stumble on something that can enhance your story. But I try not to rely on that to develop my story. I try to think through, what's the primary questions and especially the characters before I launch into it.
Very nice. Very nice.
I know that's not what everybody says though. So
yeah. No, but that's so interesting. It's, I can see how that is different from what other people do, but that's probably what makes your novels a little bit different, right, than everybody else's.
I hope. And, I'm a researcher by trade. I've run big research projects, and, research paralysis is real. People can really just get so bogged down and afraid of the research and afraid they're missing out on something that they kind of get frozen and it's hard to move forward. And so I'm really, on guard against that. And so I really try to have a very structured process so that I don't fall into that trap.
That's probably smart.
Well, I can't afford to let these projects drag on for years and years.
Yeah. So how do you decide on a historical event? How do you decide I'm going to write about the Titanic or the Donner Party, which is what the other novel, The Hunger, was about? And are there events that you want to write about in the future?
That's such a great question. And it's funny because, the Donner Party book, The Hunger, was the first one like this for me. My previous books had historical elements, but they weren't really the main focus of it, and they weren't driving the story. But, so like a lot of people, I had heard about the Donner Party growing up. They mentioned it in school. I didn't really know a lot about it because they don't go into a lot of detail. There's maybe a paragraph in the book and they sort of focus on the unfortunate end. But once I learned more about it, I realized this was a super rich story with great characters and great backstory. I mean, the crazy bad things happened from the very beginning. It didn't save it all for just the mountain. And so I realized, there's a great dramatic story to be told here. So then once The Hunger did well, in publishing, they tend to like you to stay within a certain format. I mean, not too rigidly bound. And there are some things about The Deep that are different than The Hunger. But the question is, okay, so what great disaster are you going to write about next? So that was a little daunting, right? Because it's a challenge writing these books because when it's historical, people know what the ending is. And then the question comes up in the minds of publishers, well, will they read a book when they already know what the ending is? And so you have to think of other things that make the story compelling. And so, one of them is, it's got to be, this sounds so crass, but a big enough disaster. If it's too obscure or the stakes aren't high enough, then it might not be compelling enough for people to want to read it. So the Titanic seemed like a natural choice. It's such a big disaster. It's so famous. So many people are really into the Titanic. And boy, that sounds like a weird way to put it. But it's true. And how it happened is, so I'm not a big Titanic groupie, which people just sort of assume I must have been. But one day my husband was watching a documentary on the Britannic. And I happened to be walking through the room at the time, and it said, this is the sister ship of the Titanic. And it also sank. And I had no idea there was a sister ship to the Titanic. So I sit down to start watching it with them. And then the next thing they say is, and there was a woman who survived both sinkings. And that's it. I know without even hearing her story, there is a story there. One woman surviving both sinkings. And it didn't disappoint. There was a story there and a lot more. So sometimes it's just serendipity. And, I tell people all the time, if they have an idea, if they have a favorite disaster, they want to send it to me, feel free. I've gotten a lot of suggestions, and, they're all great stories. It's just that sort of challenge of finding the one that sort of fits the zeitgeist of the moment also, like what people seem to be more interested in at the moment. And then again, crass as it sounds, it's kind of has to fit those parameters. And that, did it change history? Is there like a big so what, as we say, behind it? Like a lot of people bring up the Hindenburg. And while that's a great historical disaster, I'm not sure it would lend itself to this kind of book, because for one reason, it didn't actually change the course of aerial history. They still used dirigibles for a while after the disaster. It was a relatively small disaster. Let's face it, it was a terrible disaster. I mean, no one wants to go up in flames in the sky. So yeah, it sounds terrible, but it doesn't quite fit the parameters that I need. But other than that, send those suggestions in, dear readers.
All right, so you heard her, everyone. She wants you to send your disasters that you like. She needs book topics.
That's right. That's right. Maybe your disaster will be the next book.
So, you said, it's about finding a story that's sensational enough to draw attention, but would also lend itself to the type of fiction that you're writing. And I noticed in another interview I read that you talked about looking for aspects of history that would resonate with a modern reader as a means of keeping history fresh, because we all know about the Titanic. So how do you bring us into the story and make us care, and you're not just telling us the story that we already know?
Right. So, one of the things, I'm not a historian, by the way, by trade. I'm not a historian, I'm a researcher. I've worked with a lot of historians. And so one of the things that I found a little fascinating, but probably wouldn't surprise any historian, is how much history repeats itself. We kind of go through these cycles where it's hard to learn certain lessons, like racism is bad, or, sexism is bad. And we seem to go through these very long cycles where we have to relearn these lessons. And so that was one of the things that came out of The Hunger, for instance. It actually didn't come up until the end of the book, where, when you finish a book, you have to start working on some of the promotional stuff. And so one of them was, why is the Donner Party, why should anyone care? Why is it relevant today? So when I started looking at the place of the story of the Donner Party in history, it came at this really interesting time in American history, where a lot of very prominent themes that are important to Americans and how we think about ourselves were kind of coming to a crux. There was the westward migration, in which, it's manifest destiny that Americans were destined by God to own all the land from coast to coast, regardless of the fact that somebody already owned the land. There were people on it, Mexicans, Native Americans, and here were Americans blazing westward. It was also a time of religious intolerance. Part of what drove the westward migration was the treatment of the Mormons, and the Mormons expanding west to kind of find their own new promised land, basically. And there were other factors as well. And once I started seeing that, I saw, wow, it's super relevant for today, especially the time I was writing it, which was during the 2016 presidential elections. Try not to read the present day into it, but it was interesting to see where the thoughts converge. And so when I went to work on The Hunger, I thought, ooh, let me learn from the past. Let me look up front for what are the relative historic themes at the time, and are they relevant for today? And boy, were they ever. Class disparity and income disparity, and women's rights. Especially at the time when the book was being written, there was a lot of attacks on women's health rights and reproductive rights. And it just seemed like, we're going down some of the same, trails again when it comes in terms of history. And so that's always interesting to write. And so that's now what I try to do up front. I'm working on the third book right now, which has to do with World War II and Japanese internment. And that's actually a story that my family has a personal interest in. My husband's family, I'm Japanese, but my mom came from Japan after the war, but my husband's family were all interned in the camps. I've grown up on internment stories and really understand the Japanese point of view as well as the historical point of view. So this is making for a really interesting writing process. And I think again, unfortunately, history sort of repeating itself, and there'll be real lessons there, especially for Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can. That's so interesting because I was wondering whether you would pick the event first, which it sounds like you did, and then you're going in and thinking, how does this apply today? How can I make this relevant? Which is, I think, very smart of you.
And the books have changed too. So while the first one, The Hunger, was very, very close to the historic event, obviously with the Deep, while the main events still occur, a lot of the story is fictional, and that's starting to be a little bit more of my MO now. So with the third book, it's a completely, well, it leapfrogs off of an actual event, but outside of that, it's all completely fictional to sort of heighten the point of, the points that I'm trying to get across.
Yeah. So you're working with historical events, and you include historical people in your novels. Violet Jessup is the woman that survived both the Titanic and the Britannic sinking. So how, but she didn't end up being the main character. She's, sort of the confidant of Annie. So how do you decide which of these historical, and she's not the only one that you include. So how do you decide which of these historical figures you're going to include, and then how do you determine what roles your fictional characters need to fill?
So this has evolved a little bit over time. The first book, it was mostly real people, actual historical figures. Just one or two were completely fictional to convey certain things that needed to happen that I just felt were too much to kind of impose on a real life person. But I kind of learned from that maybe that's not the best way to go. So for instance, Tamsin Donner, who's one of the main characters, all the books are sort of ensemble books where you have about 6 or so different point of view characters that you might consider main characters, and then a cast of dozens or hundreds, depending on the event, for the secondary characters. But, I felt like I understood Tamsin after learning a lot about her, but I ended up in that book having to project a few things on her that had no historical basis. And, I try to make that very clear in the acknowledgments and all that sort of thing. But I still felt a little bad about it afterwards. So I sort of felt that if I were going to have to really project a lot on a person who actually lived, that it had to be very close to that person's life. So that's why in the Deep, that more of the main character are wholly fictional. So for instance, while Annie Hebley, who's the main character in the Deep, the Irish maid, the particulars of her life, the fact that she was a stewardess on the Titanic and that she ended up being a nurse on the Britannic, and was aboard for both, I patterned on Violet. But once I learned a bit about Violet, I just didn't feel comfortable putting her in that role. And, we keep her in the book, we honor her in the book, and hopefully she's fairly true to the character that I read about. And I did read her diary, which is available, or her memoir, I guess I should say. But that's more or less, the tack that I sort of take. Basically, I'm thinking about the story and what are the main points that I'm trying to raise, what are the themes of the book, and you figure out like what kind of characters you need to convey those themes. And then I try to look for a match among the living people. And if I feel like it's a good match, like Maddie Astor. So, as we discussed, one of the main themes of the Deep is women's rights. Women's lives were so constrained, they just didn't have legal representation. And that makes such a big difference in what kind of life you can have, whether you're a poor Irish maid like Annie Hebley, or married to the richest man in America, like Maddie Astor. And so I felt like she was the perfect character that, yeah, maybe I projected a couple things on it, but on her, but the particulars of her life were actually pulled right out of history. The age she met Astor, the situation they were in, the fact that they were sort of hounded out of America for her honeymoon, and they were coming back on the Titanic because they finally were kind of coming back to face the music, so to speak.
Yeah, great. Because I was wondering, I was like, what a woman, Violet Jessup, surviving. I mean, that's crazy, right? I mean, and I'll admit I didn't know about the Britannic until the Deep. That was not something on my radar. And
Right.
you said that you didn't know until you walked into the room and saw the documentary. So, I think I understand that, and I respect the fact that you're going to let the essence of her inspire a fictional character, so that way you're not putting anything onto the historical person that it doesn't ring true to who they were.
And hopefully, I mean, it's all a case of interpretation. It's
sure.
With the Titanic, the people are more famous, so there's more sources on them. You can feel a little bit more confident. But with the Donner Party, of course, most of those people were completely obscure, even though some of them had diaries or other people had written about them, or there were newspaper accounts. None of those were particularly trustworthy, not to cast aspersions on family members who are writing about, their descendants. But there's no yardstick really to measure the truthfulness. You can find, someone's opinion of someone from 3 or 4 or 6 different sources, and they tend to contradict one another. So, at some point you kind of have to triangulate and make your own decision. But again, I'm not writing nonfiction, I'm writing fiction. So I'm trying to make the best character I possibly can from the facts that I'm given.
Yeah. Now, I was going to ask you what delightfully horrific reimagining of history you had planned for us next, but you did mention that you were talking about the Japanese internment camps. Yeah. So, but are there any other projects on the horizon, or maybe events you are interested in exploring in the future?
Well, there's always some, the funny thing is, and I'm sure being inside publishing, you understand this, there tends to be trends. And so I think while I personally gravitate towards history that's a little bit older, right now the focus does tend to be on 20th century when we're talking historic. So I am kind of looking around there. I'm hoping that after the next book, which is tentatively titled The Fervor, that I'll have at least one more book coming out. Interestingly, I did get the opportunity to step totally away from historical horror. My next book is a spy novel. 35 years in the spy business, and I finally managed to write a spy novel.
About time.
It's harder than it sounds. They always say, write what you know, but there's complications there too in writing what you know. It can be a little bit of a straitjacket, I think, and maybe hinder your imagination a bit. So it only took 10 years, but the next book the one that comes out next spring is going to be a spy novel. It's called Red Widow, and it's completely contemporary. It's not historic in any way.
Wow. Well, that sounds really exciting. I can't wait for that one.
I'm super excited about it because I worked very closely with my editor on this, and she is really good at plot. And so she just kept kind of pushing the envelope. So it's super, super twisty. People who've read it have said, you'll never see what's coming in it. And I think I was able at the same time to stay fairly true to what it feels like to work in the business of intelligence. So if people enjoy intelligence, and I should also say it's a little bit of a woman's story too. The main characters are women. And so it kind of delves into that side of it too. What's it like in what is really still, unfortunately, pretty much a man's business.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a big, you're just making me want to read this book that much more. So as we're kind of rounding this out, I do have a couple of questions from our viewers. So someone wants to know if you can share with us any cases you worked on in the CIA that would make a good book.
Gosh, well, all the ones though that would make a good book, I can't really talk about. But I'll tell you one thing, and that is the kernel of the story that Red Widow is based on is an actual true case. And if I told you you would recognize it immediately because it was in the press. But CIA's involvement was never acknowledged. But it's changed so much in the book, you will never guess what it is in the book. But it is actually based on a true case.
Do you have to, if you know, I know you said it's based on a true case and you've made it unrecognizable, but do you have to, I mean, surely you have to be careful about what you say on the page, because you don't want any information to come to light that isn't, it shouldn't be out there. So do you have to go through some sort of process, or is that just your own experience working in intelligence? You know what you can and cannot say.
Oh no, you go through a process.
Oh,
When you get a security clearance, you sign a non-disclosure agreement, and you are bound for the rest of your life that anything you write, or if you're going to make a presentation that deals with any aspect of the work that you did, that it has to be reviewed by the agency. So it's been through pre-pub review and been clear. But yeah, the combination of working in it for so long, plus I did a stint for a year in recruitment for CIA. It was kind of a punishment because I argued with somebody I shouldn't have argued with, and they kicked me down to do a detail for a year. But ha 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 on them, it was like the most fun, and I learned so much for a year. I went out and I was recruiting for analysts in the Northeast. So like Princeton, Harvard, Yale, you know, yeah, real bad deal, Brown, that sort of thing. And when you do that, because you're speaking to people who don't have clearances all the time, you really learn what you can and cannot say to a general audience. So that actually helped me a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Oh wow. That's, I mean, do you ever feel, I mean, I guess you don't, but I think I would feel nervous if if I was broaching a topic that, like, I have to be very careful about what I say, but I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, you know, again, that tour in recruiting really helped, because in the beginning I was nervous, but you know, you're given these speeches multiple times a week in front of audiences, and after a while you just get so used to it that it really helped me a lot.
Yeah. Well, Alma, thank you so much for joining us today. This was so much fun. I hope you had fun as well.
We had a blast.
So The Deep is out now for anyone that would like to read it. I highly recommend it. It was a lot of fun. So thank you, Alma, again for joining with us. And until next time, we'll see you at our next Facebook Live author interview.